Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Reece. I'm an assistant professor at Ohio State University in the city planning program. I'm assisting Professor Whitmore with materials for week 2. And I actually have 2 mini lectures, 2 mini videos that focus on different aspects of restrictions, particularly racial restrictions in the early 20th century city. The first part of my presentation, I'm going to focus on the era of racial zoning in the early 20th century. I'm going to start with a quote from Carl Nightingale's Segregation, A Global History of Divided Cities, where Nightingale notes that segregation never comes about because it just is, as the term de facto might suggest. The bottom line is segregation has always involved some form of institutionally organized human intentionality. And I bring this quote up as opening context to think about patterns of residential segregation and racial and ethnic segregation in the early 20th century city, a time period where we see rates of segregation dramatically increase simultaneously or going along with many of the early land use regulations that take hold in contemporary US cities. I'd also want to note that as Nightingale demonstrates in his book, residential segregation is in many ways associated with post-colonial societies, or tying back to Professor Whitmore's earlier presentation, thinking about the dominance of the single-family residential use in the context of Anglo-settler societies. So while we're telling a story in particular about the United States, recognize that this is not a US phenomena, but has certainly taken on a particular structure in the context of US cities in regards to the policies and activities that segregated the city and the outcomes that we saw in the context of the early 20th century city. So thinking about the origins of zoning, as many of you all know from your planning history, US zoning comes from Western Europe, more specifically informed by early German zoning ordinances. And this is a very broad oversimplification, but if we were going to compare the early German zoning ordinances to the US zoning ordinances and how those were applied, we'd see that early German zoning focuses more on bulk and density, while the US system primarily focuses on land use. Also in the context of early German zoning, reformers who promoted zoning during this time promoted aspects of mixed use, which would be decidedly different in the context of US zoning. And also we're not wary of mixing of various classes. So the idea of kind of wealthy and poor living close in proximity to each other was not seen as problematic as we would see in the context of US zoning regimes. And pulling from Hurt's work back in 2010 to zone or not zone, the US system, as Hurt identifies here, it becomes uniquely American due to 4 primary differences: hierarchical zoning and non-hierarchical zoning. But more specifically, from the context of the week 2 materials, the dominance of the exclusively residential zone, and even more specifically, the exclusively single-family zone, with Berkeley, California creating the first single-family residential zone in 1916. We also must recognize in the context of the US system, land use regulations act as a form of social or racial control and as a mechanism to promote kind of spatial separation in the context of where different racial and ethnic populations can live. Now, pre-zoning, segregation did exist in the cities, and we also had early land use restrictions that were racially motivated. Pre-1900, we had a number of different Black codes that were found in both slave states and non-slave states prior to the Civil War, but also in the Jim Crow states during this time period after the Civil War, before the 1900s. We also see land use restrictions that are clearly maybe race neutral, but targeting particular populations. For example, San Francisco's ban on public laundries, which was a racially motivated ordinance focusing on the Chinese population of San Francisco. There was very significant kind of organized acts of intimidation, violence, and in some cases kind of white instigated domestic terrorism during this time as well, primarily to hold the color line in various cities and to prevent racial and ethnic groups from migrating out of their existing neighborhoods to find housing opportunities. And finally, again, kind of tying back to Professor Whitmore's earlier lecture, we do have to think about the importance of transportation technology and segregation in the US city. Prior to more expansive use of things like streetcars, and then eventually the embrace of the automobile for higher income folks, it was very difficult to have kind of extreme spatial segregation. But as these transportation technologies kind of opened up the footprint, the geographic footprint of the city, we begin to see more kind of radical patterns of spatial segregation in the context of where different communities live in the early 20th century city. So the rise of racial zoning would first occur in Baltimore, Maryland in 1910 and 1911, although the zoning ordinance would be modified several times all the way up to 1913. The Baltimore racial zoning ordinance identified racial restrictions by block, depending on the majority racial makeup of the block. And those who were found residing or assembling in an area that was the wrong block could face fines as well as up to 1 year in a city jail. Whites who owned property in blocks designated for the Black population were found to primarily rent their property to Black residents, often at a higher price, right? Almost a kind of an upsale, which was not only economically problematic for Black residents who didn't have access then to these homes to purchase, but it would also then restrict the growth of homeownership for the Black community during this time period. The rise of racial zoning was supported by both politicians and political movements that were seeking to radically disenfranchise the Black population, and at the same time supported by what that time period would be deemed very progressive political leaders. So the quote at the bottom of this slide, which is a very infamous quote from Baltimore Mayor Barry Mahool back in 1910, indicates a whole variety of public purposes to put this racial zoning ordinance in effect, things ranging from being wary of civil disturbance, the spread of communicable disease, and the protection of property values. The Baltimore mayor at this time was seen as a very kind of progressive leader, but still supported racial zoning just as a number of other progressives during this time period. So as we kind of think about racial zoning and the public purpose for racial zoning, I also want to reflect upon the kind of strong relationship between public health concerns during this time period and racial zoning. In particular, many of the public health sanitarians would uniformly support the Baltimore ordinance as a mechanism to avoid the spread of tuberculosis. And this was in some ways influenced by kind of early mapping analysis that would look at the distribution of tuberculosis deaths in cases throughout the Baltimore community and where those folks lived, and would often show kind of very sharp racial and spatial disparities in terms of where we saw tuberculosis cases being more prevalent. Now, the reason tuberculosis cases were more intense in some areas and in areas that predominantly were African-American was because of, in many cases, the poor housing conditions within those areas. But early racial zoning advocates kind of communicated racial zoning as a mechanism to control the spread of TB by geographically limiting where different communities could live. Um, in reality, though, the logic or rationale for this not only being kind of unethical and immoral, also really didn't make sense from a public health perspective. The ordinance still allowed Black residents to work in the white blocks as domestic workers. And so, just thinking about the transmission of tuberculosis in particular, the racial zoning ordinance would do very little in this context to actually slow the spread of tuberculosis, nor was there a very strong outcry to actually improve housing conditions for the Black community, where tuberculosis cases were the most prevalent during this time period. Racial zoning would then kind of be diffused from the Baltimore experience throughout the country, particularly in the southern states, in the mid-Atlantic, and in some areas in the Midwest and West. In the Midwest, as far north, for example, as places like Louisville and St. Louis, just to kind of demonstrate kind of the extent of racial zoning in this time period. And as Nightingale notes, the passage of Baltimore's racial zoning ordinance triggered a number of requests from local governments to the Chicago City Hall, to the Chicago Real Estate Board, to even international governments requesting kind of copycat legislation to be able to help promote segregation in their cities. So the lower courts, going up until the Buchanan case that we'll get into here in a minute, primarily would provide support for the legality of racial zoning as a constitutional use of the city or the state's police power. In Hopkins v. City of Richmond in 1915, the Virginia State Supreme Court would affirm racial zoning as not violating constitutional protection due to its grandfathering clause in the existence of some permissible mixed race blocks. Important to note during this time period that the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal position was still upheld by the courts. And so while this was a clear situation where there was very clear racial segregation and racial discrimination in the context of the legislation, because the zoning ordinance in this case allowed for some mixed race blocks, and as well as applied to some white and Black areas in terms of the scope of the ordinance, it was deemed constitutional. This takes us up to 1917, with racial zoning at this point being in existence for about 7 years, and takes us to the Buchanan v. Warley case, which emerges out of Louisville. Louisville passes a racial zoning ordinance in 1914 and proposes the ordinance as a measure to control hostility and poor race relations, as in terms of the public purpose in this context. The NAACP would continually challenge the ordinance, but the case would not work its way up to the US Supreme Court until 1917 in the Buchanan v. Warley Supreme Court case. This case would stem on a home sale which fell through due to the ordinance. Warley was attempting to buy the home of Buchanan, but could not complete the transaction because the ordinance prohibited him living on the block. This block was 80% white and therefore inaccessible to Warley in this case. Buchanan sues to force the completion of the sale, making a 14th Amendment due process claim. And again, to note, there was no equal protection claim in this particular scenario because of the legacy of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision decades earlier. So after the Supreme Court strikes down racial zoning in the Buchanan v. Warley case, one assumption is that racial zoning ends and we do not see kind of a legacy effect of this kind of early application in zoning. But the scholarship in the history in the aftermath of the Buchanan case really tells a very different story from that perspective. Racial zoning and efforts to assure segregation in housing would continue through various mechanisms. Many southern cities would continue to use the racial zone maps informally, And these measures would be enforced through different forms of kind of white domestic terrorism, harassment, and violence from entities such as the KKK. Many cities would turn to racially restrictive deed restrictions or covenants as a measure to help promote segregation. And then we would see planning experts and consultants being hired to prepare legally defensible plans, often comp plans, which would further segregation, but in some cases be facially race neutral from that perspective. And as Christopher Silver notes in what's kind of classic piece, The Racial Origins of Zoning, that creating a separation in the aftermath of the Buchanan case really necessitated comprehensive planning efforts that would promote the aims of segregation. In the wake of the Buchanan decision, quoting Silver in this case, racial zoning gave way to a broader notion of race-based comprehensive planning, which implied fundamental community improvements previously denied to the Black community. However, in practice, these improvements to these Black neighborhoods never really happened. And to give an example of kind of the permanence of racial zoning, even in the aftermath of Buchanan, we have an example here of Birmingham, Alabama's 1926 zoning map. Very interestingly, in the context of this map, the hatched areas in the map that you can almost make out, although the graphic quality is not the best in this context, these hatch areas were not listed in the legend of the map or within the zoning code, but were known to intend informally to depict where Black residents would be allowed to reside in the context of Birmingham. So even though racial zoning would be struck down, we'd still see the continuation of, or the aftermath of racial zoning really continue in cities across the US, both in the terms of plans such as these, which informally indicated where patterns of racial segregation would be, or in the context of the use of restrictive covenants that we would see in other cities, where private deed restrictions begin to take over in the context of being the primary tool of segregation, especially in the 1920s. So as we close out this first mini lecture, a couple of resources I'll point you to just to explore some of these materials. Louisville, Kentucky's Municipal Planning Department now has an Esri story map, which discusses the role of racism in the city zoning. Very interesting tool to kind of explore that history. Also, I have another link below to an archive in Birmingham, Alabama, where efforts have been undertaken to restore the city's original 1926 zoning map in order to fully document the history of racial exclusion in the city's zoning policies in housing, planning for housing. A couple of reflection questions I'll leave you with this particular lecture. In the context of Louisville, why would city planning agencies such as Louisville's document and engage the role of racism in contemporary time period in terms of understanding the city's past planning practices? Are there particular benefits to provide public engagement tools to document and introduce these topics and maybe inform contemporary debates around zoning and discrimination in zoning? Also, as a reflection question, think about the Birmingham zoning map, which was created 9 years after the Buchanan decision. How was this map and the city's zoning policy still able to promote segregated zones in the city, even though it was certainly in direct violation of the spirit of the Buchanan v. Warley decision in 1917? Thank you again for your time today, and happy to follow up with particular questions that you may have about this lecture. And you can reach me at reece.35@osu.edu, which is here in the last slide. And thanks again.